Thank you. I'd like to welcome you to today's event. My name is Danielle Walker-Palmore, and I'm the Director of Friends Provident Foundation. And I'd like to welcome you to York Festival of Ideas 2021, as we celebrate a decade of educating, entertaining, and inspiring. This event is the first of 3 in a series of events developed in partnership with us at the Friends Provident Foundation under the theme of leveling up the economy and exploring how we might achieve a fair and more sustainable economy, balancing current and future needs and operating within environmental limits. We are really excited to welcome you to today's event, but before we begin, some technical notes. If you're watching live, you can ask questions in the Q&A button on your screen at the bottom. This is available throughout the event, so questions can be asked at any time, and please do use that because, to be honest, people, that's my content. So please do ask questions, and I will make sure that Kate and Miata talk about some of the issues you raise. Should you have technical issues such as loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event by using your original link. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded and will be available on the festival YouTube channel after the 20th of June. Subtitles are available for this event. To turn these on or off, use the CC Live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. Right, now to the good bit. I'd like to introduce our fantastic speakers. Economics is quite often called the dismal science. And I absolutely challenge you to think that after you hear the conversation of these 2 women that we're delighted to have with us here today. Firstly, Kate Raworth, you may know through her books and particularly around the concept of Doughnut Economics, is an economist focused on making economics fit for the 21st century. Her book, Doughnut Economics, was 7 ways to think like a 21st century economist, is an international bestseller that's been translated into 20 languages and was longlisted for the 2017 Financial Times and McKinsey Business Book of the Year award. It's also, I have to say, personally, it's a great read. So if you haven't read it, do read it. It all makes sense to some degree. So please, if you're new to economics, please do pick it up. She is co-founder of Doughnut Economics Action Lab, working in cities, business communities, government, and educators to turn Doughnut Economics from a radical idea into a transformative action. She teaches at Oxford University's Environmental Change Institute and is Professor of Practice at Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. And a second panelist or conversationalist is Miata van Bellen, who is the Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation, or NEF. She has been at the forefront of generating new ideas on reshaping our economy inside government and out. Prior to joining NEF, she was Director of Policy and Research at the Institute of Public Policy Research, or IPPR. Before this, she's worked at senior levels in the institute, in government, in the Cabinet Office, the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. And her work has included the development of policies from devolution to local economic growth, housing, energy, and climate change, driving forward a whole range of government agendas on this in England, and also considering the broader issues of localism, which is obviously central to our concerns. Miata has a master's and PhD in economic development from the LSE and a BA in PPE from Oxford. Right, after all of that exhausting introduction, I'm going to hand over to our 2 star panelists to have a conversation. I will butt back in to make sure that your questions are also fed into the conversation. So
Danielle, thank you so much. Kate, I have to say, I've been so excited about this conversation.
Me too.
I remember when I started at the New Economics Foundation as Chief Executive, you were one of the first people that I talked to, and have just been hugely inspiring. The work that you're doing, the amazing way that you have seeded some of the ideas that are now gaining momentum has been fantastic to see. So I'm very, very excited to be on the other side of this conversation.
Oh, you're right in there with me. I'm so excited about this too. So it's a brilliant opportunity to catch up.
Brilliant. So should we start at the basics? Doughnut Economics, gaining lots of traction. What is it for the uninitiated?
Okay, so what I just noticed in Danielle's generous introduction is that we both studied PPE, politics, philosophy, economics. We both went on and studied economics university, did masters, you did a PhD. And we both ended up here in new economic thinking, transforming economics. And I think that's really interesting. So I'm going to guess we have something of a common trajectory. Tell me if it's wrong. That, you study economics. I want the tools of public policy. I want to know this mother tongue of policy making. And when I arrived at university in the early 1990s, I was just, first of all, I was so busy learning the economic theory to catch up because I'd never studied it before. But it took me at least a year to realize, hang on, the issues I came here for, they're not really on the agenda. Where's environmental protection? Where's social inequality? We often start by saying, well, assume inequality as given. And now, and we never really deeply dived into these things. So I walked away from academic economics and was really frustrated by it. I worked in Zanzibar for 3 years. I worked at the UN in New York for 4 years. I worked at Oxfam for a decade. And I'd long been an admirer of the work of Neff, and we'll come back to that later. And then I was a mother of twins, and then there was a global financial crisis. And I remember just hearing on the TV as I sat with my little babies, I remember watching the TV, the economists came rolling out saying, we need to rewrite economics to reflect financial realities. And I just thought, I'll be damned if we're only going to rewrite economics for that. Like, there's a lot of crises been going on for decades. So if this is a moment where economics is getting opened up, I want to be part of that big team that brings in this rethinking. And it set me back to my textbooks to think, wow, those ideas I was taught, graffiti, like intellectual graffiti on the mind, I want to be part of the team that rewrites them. And the donut concept was a concept I'd drawn that was getting a lot of interest and traction. I thought this can be part of the story of new economics. So that's for me. In the book I wrote, it was the book I wished I could have read when I was a student that would have told me, hey, if this theory doesn't all make sense to you, it's not you, it's the theory. Hang in there with your instincts and beliefs and convictions because their time is coming. So to the donut, what is Doughnut Economics? The donut is, you can think of as a compass for human prosperity in the 21st century. Here it is, I have it on a stick, like many things I have now as the result of lockdown. So imagine humanity's use of Earth's resources radiating out from the center of this picture. That means that the hole in the middle of the donut is a place where people are left falling short on the essentials of life. It's where people don't have the resources they need for good food, education, healthcare, decent housing, a decent income, political voice, transport, connection, community, gender and racial equality. We want to leave nobody in this hole. And I can say that with conviction because these are drawn from the Global Sustainable Development Goals. So all the governments in the world have already agreed that every person in the world has a claim not to live in this hole. Great. So we need to use Earth's resources to meet people's needs. The challenge there is that as we use Earth's resources, we begin to put pressure on the life supporting systems of this planet. And we begin to push so far that we hit what's called the ecological ceiling here. We begin to break down the very systems that sustain us. So we cause climate breakdown. We acidify the oceans, we create a hole in the ozone layer, we break down the web of life, converting too much of Earth's surface for human use, using too much synthetic fertilizer. And these are the 9 planetary boundaries that were first recognized by Earth system scientists in 2009. So this is incredibly recent, this recognition of what are the life supporting systems of this planet that keep her in a stable balance for all of humanity. So put those two things together in the simplest of terms, the goal of the donut is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. There's 2 sets of boundaries. And I profoundly believe that those boundaries unleash creativity. They certainly unleash a pressure on us to innovate and recreate our economies. And the last thing I'll add here, which I know will resonate with you, Whenever I show people the donut, and I show just how far outside the donut we are, billions of people currently fall short on the essentials of life. We are well overshooting multiple planetary boundaries. I say, you know, last century's economic theories and governmental policies and business models and community organizing wasn't designed to solve this, because they never saw this. This wasn't their challenge, it's ours. And if we're seeing a new picture and we're seeing a new challenge, we need to come up with theories and policies and business models and community action of our own. And you could either say that's utterly overwhelming, or you could say this is a phenomenal time to be an economist, because we have to rewrite it for 21st century realities. And I have to say that's what I've seen the New Economics Foundation been doing for decades since it was founded. And that's why I'm so glad about this conversation. I think we're part of big teamwork. It takes a network of ecosystem of many different organizations internationally doing different parts of the work that needs to transform our economies. So there's the core essence of Doughnut Economics. What is it that will enable us to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet?
And the thing is, I mean, I've read the book. It's amazing hearing you talk about it. It's so intuitive. It's actually so simple. It's a bit of a no-brainer. And obviously, you know, it's completely in line to the work that we do at NEF.
Yeah.
And the thing that I keep asking myself is, given how obvious it is, why is it we're not doing it? What has meant that actually, you know, the ideas of Doughnut Economics, the ideas of new economics are on the margins rather than the mainstream?
Wow. Okay. I'm going to jump straight in there. I'm going to give two answers, and then I'm going to ask you, because you've thought about this a lot too. Okay. Two reasons why I think that these ideas are on the margins, not the mainstream. And I'm going to go back to the economics education that we both had. One, most economics degrees around the world, you arrive in lecture number one, right? And the professor will say, welcome to economics. Here is the market, and stick supply and demand in front of you, which is an extraordinary move. As if to say, the first thing you need to know about economic thinking is that there's such an organization as the market, and it puts supply and demand of goods and services that are priced and marketed in front of us. It puts price as the metric of concern. So suddenly we're now measuring things with this metric. And it means by default that anything that falls outside the price contract is called an externality. Well, the entire living world and its degradation falls there. So if, you know, we are now in the 21st century witnessing the death of much of the living world, and an economist will nod and say, yes, yes, we call that an environmental externality. And to me, I say that is alarm bell enough that that theory, that framing does not fit our times. The living world is not an externality. You've just started in way too small a place, and you need to start with a bigger vision of the economy, in society, in the living world. So it's that first encounter of economics. But also the second thing that I think is really problematic about this market-based thinking is that markets are actually a really powerful tool. Adam Smith was onto something, right? Market mechanisms can be an amazing way of coordinating through the price the wants and needs of, no, not the wants and needs, the wants of millions of people and what other millions of people are willing to supply. And they can therefore, never having to talk or meet, they can supply for their wants. So yes, the butcher, the brewer, and the baker will supply your dinner. By the way, your mum in the kitchen made it. Let's not forget unpaid caring work. But markets are powerful. He was onto something. There's just two caveats. One, markets only serve those who can pay. The rest they ignore. And they only value what's priced. The rest they exploit. And that point about markets only serving those who can pay, I just remember being really stumped every time in my economics courses. They would say, well, take initial income distribution as given. Would this intervention improve things? And I say, why do we just take initial income distribution as given every time? Why can't we ask who is failing to be met by the needs, by the servicing of markets, and what else could be done there? And I think that question's opened up really interestingly over the last couple of decades, and NEF's work has been really instrumental in it. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think is behind why what seems like a no-brainer? I agree. Meet the needs of all people, live on this unique living planet. What's not to like? Which bit didn't we get? Why do you think economics is not oriented towards that already?
Yeah, and I've agonized a lot over this. And I think probably two things. I'll oversimplify, but I completely agree with you about the way that economics is taught about and thought. And when I go back and think about how I'd been taught it and the realities that I see now, I mean, there's a huge chasm. But more profound than that, the rules of the game that determine how the economy is set are so laden with a whole set of assumptions that are a million miles from the realities of people's lives. And it's interesting thinking about my time in government, or even like now when I sort of go and I talk to colleagues, they're just a set of assumptions that actually no one questions, but they're so baked in. And when you come, you know, I was having a recent conversation with some former colleagues in government, and I was making the argument around, you know, all the kind of hype around the deficit being something that is convoluted, because in the end, the Bank of England is buying a whole lot of government debt. So it's, and they just could not compute. So there are some set of assumptions that are so baked into the very people that construct the rules of the game of how the economy works, that means that it compounds a particular way of thinking. And I think alongside that, because rules can be changed, but they require people to change them. And the thing that I think economics has done a disservice to people on is that it feels so abstract, it feels so opaque. You know, in the end, the economy is the interaction of a whole set of people, and we have huge agency. But partly the language we use, the way we talk about it, we've mystified it so that people don't understand their own power and agency. And we did some really interesting work at NEF looking at, you know, the way that people thought about the economy. We went and we sort of talked to lots of people and polled them. And the big message was people thought it was this thing that was done onto them, this thing that they can have impact or influence on. And I think that's really powerful in entrenching. And then for me, the third bit of the puzzle, as I sort of tried to kind of understand it, is that in the end, the model that we had sort of worked. There was a social contract that says, grow the economy, trickle down will work, everyone will be lifted up, and yes, the system will be deeply unequal and unfair, and yes, there will be externalities, but we're all doing okay. And I think that that contract has broken down massively in the last couple of decades, and it's been driven by two things. I think the nature of the climate crisis is pushing us to a tipping point where there is an implicit trade-off there that we haven't talked about and gripped. And I think people are now talking about it and gripping it and thinking, what is this thing where we grow and we consume, and we are, by doing that, fundamentally undermining our own existence? I mean, that is madness. So I think that's been one of the drivers. And then I think the second most acute driver is that contract. You know, so what we've seen, particularly since the financial crisis, is, you know, the deal was the economy grew and living standards rose. The link was clear. You know, we focused on GDP because it was a proxy for living standards. Well, we've had a decade in which, you know, the economy grew at points, but people's living standards have not budged. And I always say this, I was just like, you know, 10 years, more than 10 years, in which living standards have not shifted. I mean, it's unprecedented. And we'll come on and talk about the pandemic in a second, but what's scary is that, you know, all the projections suggest that by 2026, average incomes will have been no higher than in 2008. What is this system that cannot guarantee improvements of living standards? And I think for a lot of people, that sense that the economy just doesn't work for them, and it certainly doesn't work for the planet, has sort of dropped. And that's why I feel, and I don't know how much of that is hopeful thinking rather than a reality, but it feels like something is shifting. And I think it took all of those factors, it took us being in deep crisis, quite frankly, for people to look at the old settlement, the old model, and think, what on earth is this? And it certainly isn't serving me. And this is the moment for change. And the pandemic, I think, has just blown all of that up.
And some people's living standards have risen over the last decade. So the number of billionaires worldwide has doubled from 1,000 billionaires to 2,000 billionaires. So of course, that increasing human activity and that rising GDP is going into somebody's pocket. It's just not going into the pockets of the people who actually need that. And so that huge inequalities, why take initial inequality as given? That's the very thing we should explore and open up if we're going to do this. And I really agree with you, actually, what you were saying about it seemed to work. And I think through much of the 20th century, it seemed to work. The goal was growth. And if we grow economies and income, and we have quite labor intensive industries and a lot of people are employed in them, then a lot of that growth will go into the wage packets of workers who take it to their families, and we can provide public goods and people can afford to buy and pay for these wants and needs, and everyone comes over the social foundation. And it's actually this sort of more 21st century realization of, as you said, the climate crisis and our impact on other planetary boundaries. Whoa, there's an outer limit to this as well. And so we can't just use growth and endless growth to solve this, because endless growth takes us into a boundary that threatens to undermine everything. So I really agree with you on the importance of that. I would love to talk about what's going on in the social foundation, because, and let me tell you why. So the goal of the social foundation, leave nobody falling short in the essentials of life. And there are many ways you can do this, right? You can meet people's essential needs through ensuring that everybody has the income, for example, to provide for some of their needs. You can also do it through public goods, ensuring that public goods are providing these essential needs. And I think in most societies, it's provided through a mix between the market and the state, but also the household and the commons. And I think it's a really great opportunity to question that mix. And what is the right mix that actually effectively, when should it be public services? When should it be through the market? And what can you do to ensure that everyone has access to the market? So how do we get people out of this hole in the social foundation? Now I'm going to tell a little story. I joined Oxfam in the early 2000s. And I remember in the first couple of years, so I'm going to say around 2003 or 4, I remember somebody from the New Economics Foundation coming, giving a lunchtime talk. And they were giving a lunchtime talk about this idea called a universal basic income. And I remember sitting in this lunchtime talk and thinking, wow, that is a wild idea, but come on, that's not actually ever going to happen. I mean, that's just way too radical. That's just not going to happen. So I'm telling this because, of course, here we are almost 20 years later. Now, it's not happening, but my goodness, there's some really interesting trials going on from Stockton in California to Finland, and some very powerful results coming out. And I know you've been involved in that. But also the work that you're doing around the social guarantee. I'd really love to hear about that, because to me, that work, the questioning of can a UBI and when could a UBI be a valuable part of ensuring all people's needs, and then this idea from NEF of social guarantee, because this is crucial. We're beginning to put in place different ideas and options for the kinds of mechanisms that could make it actually true that nobody is left falling short in the essentials of life. So tell us about those ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, and it's interesting because I think it definitely feels like the space for these sorts of ideas are kind of opening up. And it's really basic. When we think about the contract between citizens and, the society in which, for us, there should be a basic social guarantee. And there's sort of 3 parts of that. One that says, you have a, call it basic income, call it living income. There is an expectation that there is an income level below which we say no one can fall. And for me, I think, one of the big scandals, and we've done, some of the analysis going into the kind of pandemic and before, we're now entering the stage where there are 1 in 3 people in this country, 1 in 3 people who are struggling to get by, who cannot afford the basics to live on in the 6th richest country in the world. I mean, it's absolutely staggering. Yeah. And so for us, that flaw that says, everyone should be able to feed their families. Everyone should be able to clothe their kids. People shouldn't have to choose between heating or eating. That must be a basic guarantee for everyone, for us as the first building block. Alongside that, in the world of work, we have this incredible situation where in-work poverty is a massive issue. People are working and being paid poverty wages, and we know we can mitigate against that. So drive forward a real living income. Say, again, people are paid enough to afford the basics to live on. And then you combine that with a package of services, universal basic services, that says these are things that are foundational for people to thrive and for people to flourish. And that is education, that is health, that is social care, that is childcare. I say that as a mother of 3 with twins as well. It is yes. Absolutely foundational. It is housing, it is broadband in the digital age. And actually everyone should have access to that. And we should club together in order to provide that collectively. free at the point of use. And actually, if you give people those three fundamental social guarantees, the three planks of that social guarantee, you create the basis for people to live good lives. You create the basis for people to thrive. And people, say to me, gosh, that's radical. I'm like, it really isn't. It's quite common sense. And it's not beyond the wits of us to do that. And I think the thing that gives me hope, we were talking about some of these ideas before, but I think the thing that's really interesting over the course of the pandemic is that it does, and I'd love your take on this, because sometimes I wonder whether it's kind of wishful thinking or if it feels real, but it feels like actually the pandemic has shone a spotlight on so many issues in a way that, those of us who were talking about it, we're railing about it, but actually people have sort of seen it in floodlights, the inequalities, actually the challenges of not responding to natural crisis in a way that feels like it is creating consensus for change. And ideas like a social guarantee, that are critical to the social foundation, it feels like potentially they're gaining traction in the way they weren't before. But I don't know what your read on it is.
I agree. And so after Doughnut Economics came out as a book in 2017, I found so many people coming up to me saying, no, but I actually want to do this. I'm a teacher. I want to teach it in the classroom. I'm a town councillor. I'm taking it into our next meeting. I work in business. I'm taking it to my company boardroom. So I set up Doughnut Economics Action Lab with a co-founder to work with pioneering change makers who wanted to put it in practice. And over the last year, particularly, we've been contacted by so many city councillors, town councillors, so at the level of cities and places, people in a position of governance, power and opportunity in their city, having just been in the midst of the COVID crisis or still in the midst of it, they're getting in touch. Because I think they are seeing from where they are the massive effect. Of course, they've had to respond to everything. I mean, if you want to meet a real economist who manages a household, I would say meet a mayor who has to manage housing and transport and food and COVID and everything and inequality and expansion. I mean, the reality of managing that, they see the whole thing. And they're coming more and more because they're saying, actually, this Doughnut framework encompasses everything that we already know we have to do and all the transformations we know we have to make. We know we need to become far more distributive by design because there is such inequality in our city. We know we need to become regenerative by design because we know we're having impacts of climate change and material use worldwide. And a really striking number of them are coming saying this COVID crisis shut everything down. And now as we open up, where do we want to go? We know we're going to be rebooting and reinvesting and rebuilding our economy. Where do we want it to go to next? So I was very struck by the city of Amsterdam, who we've been working with to do what we call a city portrait, which says, how can your city become a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? Big question, but these are big times. We need to ask these questions. We'd worked with Amsterdam to do their Amsterdam city portrait. Actually, I have it here. And we produced it sort of in late 2019. And they decided to launch it in April 2020, in the month in which they had the highest COVID infection rate. And the deputy mayor says, look, the reason we did this is, one, we can't stop policy making because otherwise there'll be a massive backlog. And there are lots of other critical crises in our city. But also, as we emerge from this emergency, where do we want to go? We need something that we're aiming for. We know we need to build back jobs. We don't want to build back the old jobs, the fossil fuel jobs that we're actually polluting. We need to create new jobs, so we need a really strong direction to be going in. And I'm struck by, of course, I think crisis is opportunity. Transformation doesn't happen in calm times. It happens when the cracks open up in history, and there's that moment where people can say, are we going to do that now? That thing we've been talking for decades. Is this it now? This is it now. We're going. And some take it and some don't, and some just retreat and build back to what they had. But I think traction of universal basic income, gosh, it was Milton Friedman, wasn't it, who said, in times of crisis, the people turn to the ideas that are lying around. Well, the donut's been lying around for a decade. Universal basic income has been lying around for at least 2 decades. These ideas are now having traction. People say, actually, let's do this and let's try this. So I think that the work of the social guarantee, which is as much of a no-brainer as the donut, like, people should have sufficient income, they should have a living wage, and they should have access to public services, which bit of that is controversial. Let's try it and let's do it. And your work is focused in the UK. Let's learn from what can happen here, because what I've really been struck by over the last 3 years of the work we're doing at Doughnut Economics Action Lab is the power of peer-to-peer inspiration. It's not news, but it's so striking when you see it in action. So I can stand on a stage or go on a podcast and say, oh, here's a donut, and wouldn't it be amazing if our towns and cities aim to live in the donut? It's a completely different matter when a mayor or a councillor stands up and say, yeah, we've adopted this because we see this as a really powerful vision for our place, and this is how we're using it. And you can see other people just listening, and mayors and town councils listen in a completely different way. So a lot of our work focuses on amplifying their voices and showcasing their stories, because they are, of course, the most powerful, inspiring change makers to make that happen. So yes, I do think this is one of those cracks in history that can be seized, and some people are seizing it and putting it into a real possibility of change.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And it does, it's interesting, you know, we're having very similar conversations, and place after place, the thing that, you know, we hear back is, we've got a huge challenge to recover, but we can't recover to the thing that we had before, because, you know, yes, we may have had parts of our economy growing, we may have done the infrastructure spend, but our communities were being left behind. You know, so many of our communities weren't being lifted up by our interventions. We've got to try something different. And it feels like there is a kind of boldness to try something different. And, you know, and it cuts across political persuasion. You know, we're working with, you know, the likes of Hampshire as much as we're working with the likes of, you know, Northern Times. So it does feel like there is a moment. And, you know, ideas like the community wealth building, Danielle talked about it at the start, which is so aligned with work that you're doing through the lab. But that sense that actually, you know, local partners can come together, they can have real power and agency. And actually, if you think across the system of a place, and for starters, you know, think about the spending you do in that. How do you gear that to deliver social value? How do you gear that to deliver environmental value? Just start with that question. You know, often when we go into a place, we will track the flows of investment, which is obviously often much bigger than an individual partner thinks, because they're only thinking about their spend. And then we said, imagine if you geared this towards trying to transform your local economy. Imagine if you put conditions around living wage jobs in return for contracts, or in return for services. Imagine if you use the procurement power of your collective institutions to try to gear your economy. Imagine if you were trying to invest in alternative ownerships, you know, your co-ops, social enterprises, community enterprises, so that you are building the base of your local economy. And it is all within your grasp. And, you know, it's been hugely inspiring, the appetite and the determination against really, really tough times, you know. And I always say, this is not an easy ask. You know, the background of, you know, a decade of austerity, it's not an easy ask. But as you say, the times demands it. And what's exciting is that the tools are there, you know, and organizations like ourselves and others, Claire's, Co-ops, you know, there is an ecosystem of people who've been trialing and testing this. And it feels like ambition in particular. And that's where I'm most excited.
So let me jump in. Another kudos to NEF, because I remember another workshop I was at Oxfam, and some friends from NEF came and ran and talked to us about some work they were doing called the leaky bucket. I don't know if you, right? The leaky bucket. Your local economy can be like a leaky bucket. People are spending money. It's going straight out to those multinational corporations. Thank you very much, say the newly minted billionaires. And how do you plug the holes in that bucket and keep more of that money local? Well, I think that's exactly what's grown into what's now community wealth building. So kudos to NEF being ahead on the game on that as well. I want to share this, which is, with every town or city place we work with, we say, look, you need to think of the design, the deep design of your place. So first of all, what's your purpose? What are you serving? Are you serving growth, or do you have a vision of thriving in your place, or well-being? So Amsterdam has redefined its purpose to be a thriving, inclusive, regenerative place for all residents while respecting the planetary boundaries. That's powerful, but it has to be backed up by who are you networking with? And here comes that community wealth building. Use your anchor institutions, your city hall, your schools, hospitals, universities, museums. How are they procuring, and how do you use that budget locally? How do you relate to your citizens and residents and engage them in deliberative democracy? How are you governed? Who has voice in decision making? What are your metrics of success? But then crucially, how is your place owned? Who owns the sources of wealth creation? So who owns the land and housing? In the city of Vienna, over 60% of people live in city-owned housing or cooperatively run housing. And so it's affordable. And that means that affordable housing is high quality, center city, normal, totally transforms affordability in the city. But so many other cities have got a huge problem around rent and affordability because they haven't, like Vienna said, well, housing is a human right, so we're going to own it like this. Who owns the utilities? Paris has brought back under public control its water utility, having privatized it in the 80s, because they realized we want control over this, and the revenues are really valuable for reinvesting in public services. Who owns the data? Who owns the businesses? Through community wealth building, you can have businesses that are locally owned, cooperatively owned, employee owned. So you can do so much there. And of course, what are the finances doing? Where the finance is coming from? How are they being invested and divested? City pensions, divest from fossil fuels. Can you help set up city-owned banks? I've been really struck from talking with some cities how much they depend upon car parking charges as their funding. That's really tough. If you want to get rid of cars in your city centre, but you're actually funding your services right now with car parking, or cities that depend upon business rates from shops and restaurants in the central business district, and there's nobody going in now. So they're trying to drive everybody back in to get the money from those shops and restaurants, to get the revenue to run the services. So all the financial lock-ins, and can we reinvent this model of how cities are financed so they're not driving, they're not pushing for cars to come in and commuting to come in. So to me, these are really key design questions that we go into deeply with every city and say, what can you already stop doing? What could you already start doing? And what do you need to do with others to make this wider change?
It's incredible because there's a pathway, there's a roadmap.
There's a roadmap.
There is a roadmap.
Hey, should we invite Danielle to join us again? She might have some questions from people that have popped up.
I do. That was fantastic. And in fact, you have answered some of them by your conversation. So some questions that were coming up throughout. But if I just kind of group some of the questions that I've read through into three kind of general buckets. One, kind of Doughnut economics, and actually new economics, I think, in policy terms. So people are asking specific questions like, you know, how does this really work? And I mean, you gave some really great examples of Amsterdam, and we know what's going on in Preston and in various other parts of the UK, but maybe some talking a little bit about the mechanics of how this might work in some specific instances. So touch on that. The second one is actually the way we think. So people are asking some very deep questions saying, you know, actually, how do we get at the psychology of what a good life is? You know, how do we get it, trying to get almost a redefinition of what we think of as human flourishing, perhaps. And I thought that was a really interesting sort of bucket of questions. And the third one is really interesting, coming from students and people embarking on their economic careers, so to speak, saying, you know, how do I make sure I am like getting the right kind of economics teaching that I'm able to kind of question, and what are the resources there to help me kind of be a good economist going forward and really meet the promise of being a 21st century economist. So we take those buckets. I mean, actually, I thought we might start with that last one, because I think we all know some really great resources in terms of teaching of economics and the nature of economics as a study, as an area of study. For instance, we know really well Rethinking Economics. I know, Kate, you do, and that's a great resource for students, and I'll put that somewhere in the chat or in response. Rethinking Economics is a great resource for students, but also there's some sort of examples of really trying to come up with new curricula. I don't know if Kate or Miata, Kate, do you want to start with that, since you're actually teaching?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. So Rethinking Economics, fantastic movement of students who, like me, when the financial crisis hit, they were like, hang on a minute, as Miata's saying, we don't really understand how money works. In fact, we're taught that money's neutral and don't worry about banks. You know, they were taught just a completely false model of how finance works. So they said, we're really embarrassed down the pub because our friends are like, you know, come on, you study economics. What's going on in this crisis? And like, I don't know. So I think it was an amazing movement that grew out of that, and it's international. And I think the power that the students are questioning from within, they've signed up for this discipline, and then they're demanding that it be changed. So they're taught what's fit for the future. I think there's also a fantastic website called Exploring Economics, which is a lovely introduction to say, you know what, there are many schools of thought. There's feminist economics, ecological economics, complexity economics, Neoclassical economics, you know, they're all different kinds, and you've only just been taught one little box of that. So people go, whoa, this is amazing and exciting. There's also a new initiative, I can't remember its name at this moment. There's a new initiative that for inviting new economic curricula to post themselves on a site and recognize themselves. And this is happening more and more. And if I remember, I will post it in the chat box. But I think it's crucial that the curriculum is rewritten. And I'll tell one story here. Sometimes people say, oh, the curriculum will get rewritten, you know, one funeral at a time. And I think that's not true. Sometimes actually the older economists are the most liberated. They've been tenured for years and they're like, actually, what the heck was this thing? And they can be some of the most radical thinkers. I had a really strong experience with presenting my work in Belgium at one point to a group of current professors at the university. And after the presentation, one young professor came up to me and said, I really like your ideas. I'd love to teach them, but I'm on track for getting tenure, so I have to be cautious. And to me, that was like, this guy's mid-30s. That's devastating. So it's not about the individuals, it's about the structures and incentives and what is seen as a credible publication, what is seen as good content. And this is taking far too long to change, and we need to speed up the rate at which it changes.
Yeah, and I agree with much of that, and all the results, rethinking economics, are all brilliant. I think the only two things I'd add is one, just question. You know, it was interesting. I heard someone give a presentation from INET, and they just talk through the basic assumptions. And actually, if you just, you know, rather than just consume, just listen to those assumptions. You know, there is no collective. We have no empathy. We all, you know, work to maximize our individual. Like, none of that is real. And I think just the questioning and actually throwing the questions back into the system is the first place to start. I think the second thing I'd say is, there is now an ecosystem of organizations that define as new economics. So, you know, all you have to do is go and Google, and there's so many resources, you know, lots of organizations throwing out really interesting ideas, great policy. There's a new initiative that, you know, Danielle has supported. New Economics Briefing is hopefully going to be a portal that will have a whole load of content, policy ideas, debate, all from across the ecosystem. So it will give you huge exposure to just some of the ideas to day-to-day issues that just gives you a different lens to the lens that you hear through the mainstream.
I think that's such a powerful message as well. And you guys are both kind of living examples, you know, that you have agency. So Sylvia and Emma were particularly asking questions around that. And I think you have agency, you can find out. So you're being taught stuff, you know, you ignore your parents. You know, everyone knows that this doesn't, you know, just because some adult said it doesn't mean that it's right. And I think that questioning, just bring that right into the classroom. I think that's really, it's a powerful thing to do. I think just moving on to the sort of policy bit. So some really good, interesting questions about, you know, how does this work in terms of, you know, the way house prices work, or the way that we look at city policies. I mean, one of the questions was actually saying this is all happening at sub-regional or sub-national level, where there are examples. How do we move on to that? How do we move to that higher, you know, that level of national policies? And I don't know if you have any kind of ruminations, particularly Miata coming from government, but also Kate obviously working in the Netherlands, just to kind of give some insights, and particularly just to say some of those questions were coming from Scotland and Wales. So, you know, and I'm, you know, completely obsessed with Wales. I think Wales is fantastic, and we should get all excited about Wales. But anyway, Miata, thoughts at the national and sub-regional?
Yeah, so I mean, the two things I'd say is the sub-regional stories. So, you know, the examples of Scotland that has a wellbeing economy, of Wales that's doing future generations, of lots of kind of mayoralties, lots of local authorities, suggest that the policy pitch isn't that hard. You know, we know, as you know, as Kate says, we know the route map, we know the set of things to do, and actually we have places and indeed people, you know, community groups that are doing things differently. So that is part of it. It's just trialing and testing ideas. You know, the idea for UBI is now something that's being tested in lots of different places to see whether it works. But, you know, the policy bit is almost the easy bit. Getting it to work and implement it in the system is a much harder proposition. But that's where I'd start. But alongside that, and this is very much our kind of our model, our theory for change, is that in part you just need to see these ideas, you need to make them happen, you need to test them to demonstrate proof of concept on the ground, but we also need to change the rules, and that requires national policy change, and that requires change in terms of the way, you know, I'd start with the Treasury. There are some fundamental assumptions that are a big constraint for how we do things. And again, you know, there are ideas there. There are ideas about, you know, at the moment the government is talking about the green recovery. It's a great catchphrase, it's a great buzz word, but breaking it down. And for us, you know, we use the language of a Green New Deal, but part of that equation is a big investment package. So a really simple policy measure you could do is in the short term, you know, we say a 48 billion fiscal stimulus into the economy, into trying to, you know, do things like retrofitting at scale, because we know we need to decarbonize homes. But you then align that, you know, investment in social care, because actually, if you look at public sector jobs, they're really low carbon. So actually, that's our route to a low carbon economy. But then you have to sort of align that with long-term spending, local industrial strategies that are trying to think about how they decarbonize, but in a way that's just. So, you know, we know the individual policy pieces that you could drive across government, but it requires political will. It requires a bit of imagination, and it requires a willingness to, you know, shift from some ways to do things. And, you know, the last year and a half has showed us that, you know, when we were told that things were impossible, when we were told that we couldn't invest at scale, when we were told that, you know, of course you couldn't have something like furlough, where you're sort of giving people a minimum income so that they can rebound back. That's crazy. None of it is crazy. It is possible, it's doable. And by the way, you can do it pretty quickly. So it's about changing the rules of the game, but that requires us to change politics. And this is the last thing I'd say. You know, I've worked inside government, I've worked outside of government, and if you like, the light bulb for me is governments will respond to what people want, particularly this government, by the way, because they poll every day. Everything they do is based on polling. And actually, we need to have both belief in the public that we don't have to be resigned to the way that things are. Change is possible. We need ideas about what that change looks like so we can root our aspiration in reality. And then we need to get organized, and we need to mobilize, and we need to get a voice so that we're shifting the politics so that the politicians respond. So yeah, my headline is, we kind of know what we need to do. We know it's possible. We need to shift the politics so that becomes the mode of operating.
Brilliant. Kate, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I love everything Mia's just said, and I'm just going to jump in again with an example from a particular place that I think is in action, and it's Amsterdam. It's a place I've been working with, seen. So they knew they wanted to implement a circular economy policy. Instead of resources being used up, they would be used again and again. And this is crucial. Just as we need to tackle climate change and cut our carbon emissions, we also need to massively reduce the material footprint of cities and places and nations in the global north that are way overshooting planetary boundaries, not just within their own borders, but all the clothing and food and electronics and construction materials and consumer goods that are imported from all over the world. And the stream of waste that's shipped out has a massive impact on running down the living planet. So that needs to become a far more circular and cyclical economy. Amsterdam said, right, let's go and do this. In fact, the Netherlands provided leadership and said, we're going to be 100% circular by 2050. 50% circular by 2030, and Amsterdam translated that absolutely into their own local regulations, but gone further. That's great, having a long-term goal, a decadal ambition, and then it said, right, by 2023, all tenders for the built environment will be circular, and by 2022, next year, 10% of all government procurement contracts will be circular. So what I love about that is it gives a long, loud legal message to business. You are really welcome to do business in our city, but if you want to stick around, you've got to get circular. So just start changing now. Now you can leave it until the 2029 if you want, and it'll suffer terribly when you've got to convert. Or you can. We're making 10% of the contracts ready next year. So do you want to be a leader and a pioneer? And I know that in the built environment, particularly, architects and builders and planners at first might think, oh, all these new regulations, because materials have to now have a material passport of where they've been and how they've been used and how they can be used again and again if they're disassembled. Where are materials going to be stockpiled? How are we going to have a database? So there's actual physical, spatial changes that need to be put in place. And you need to change the way you design. You can't glue and cement things together. You bolt and clip them together so they can be unbolted and unclipped. Architects and planners might start by saying new regulations, but I know that in that city, they said, oh, hang on, Now that we're on top of that, now that we're starting to design this way, we suddenly find ourselves at the forefront of the circularity revolution. And that means we've now got design skills that are going to be wanted in cities around the Netherlands, in cities across Europe, around the world. We've, thanks to the boundaries that our government have put in place, we've just jumped. It's forced us into that creativity. And I meet students in that city who've studied circularity in university and materials design or economy. And they're leaving university and I can see they're saying, you mean we actually get to do this? Because so many students study all these new ideas and then, okay, that was very nice. Now, please enter the real world, mainstream, business as usual, put that back in your back pocket. That's for dreamers. These are actually getting to do it in the city. And I feel an energy and a creativity that's been unleashed there because of the clarity of these boundaries. There's also an experimental district called Bijkslotterham, where it's dedicated to a circular living lab. So anything that gets constructed and built there, housing, offices, it must be circular. Now, that's a place for experiment. We learn, because we don't yet know how to do this. Some things work, some things don't work, but it's all learning. And that side of experiment within the city then becomes practice for the citywide. And then cities, coming back to this city versus nation. The city is a site of experiment. Stockton, California, everyone's watching. What happened with the universal basic income there? Amsterdam, circularity, what's happening there? Different cities become that site of experiment. And I'm convinced that they give courage and actually that push of if there, why not here, to other cities and national leaders. And I think some of these things are going to spread and scale up in this way.
That's really fascinating. We should probably remind ourselves that, of course, Finland is, trying to do UBI, isn't it, as a country? So perhaps we should all sort of look and see how that process happened. How did they move to even wanting to go there? It's a really interesting point. I mean, actually, it does link, and that it links to a point. I think you answered some of the questions. I think Phoebe in particular was asking a question about how we move from an extractive economy to one which is much more about restoring planetary boundaries and living within them. And I think that's a really great example. Circularity is a good solution to that, or this sort of the beginning of one. But I think it gets at some of the deep things about our assumptions around growth. And how do we measure, first of all, growth? Discuss. I mean, that could be a whole other whole point. But how do we conceptualize and think about the nature and how we measure growth, and particularly GDP? And it'd be really good to know how you've been dealing with reconceptualizing, and perhaps Miata, in terms of changing the rules in terms of GDP as a really important indicator of economic health that is constantly held up. I mean, I think today we got some figures, didn't we? Yeah. So it's just really get at those sorts of technical things. How do we deal with the changing of the rules, and how does it work with Doughnut concepts as well?
Yeah, I mean, today GDP figures are out. We're all obsessing it. It's telling us that we're recovering 2.3% growth, despite the fact there are huge swathes of the economy that are struggling and big chunks of our society whose living standards have plummeted. It is a bad proxy. And for me, when we're sort of thinking about, because it's a bit of a, doing all of this at national scale or global scale is a huge endeavor. And I don't think we should pretend that it's not. And so you need to think about what are the things that create a domino effect. And for me, one of the big things that can create a domino effect is shifting from what is our metric of success or economic success that then feeds into societal success. And we still think this thing, GDP growth, is our metric of success, despite, as I say, the fact that it has been completely de-linked from the one thing that we did care about, which is whether people's lives will get better, living standards were improving. So at some point, you have to wonder, why are we tracking this thing, even if you don't go into the huge downsides from an extractive economy that is growing too much? And, shifting towards well-being. And I think it's starting to get traction, so Scotland has its well-being framework. We've got New Zealand that are doing well-being, Iceland, Finland. So that measure that says, actually, the thing that we care about the economy are robust. It's about our environment. It's about, how people, going back to Kate's Doughnut Economics, it's about how people are living and are thriving and are doing a good life. And actually, what are the indicators that give us a sense of that? And you break those down, and that's your starting point. So you create a basket of things that you say, this is what we care about as a country. And then actually, can we find some indicators, some economic data that tells us whether we're doing well or not on these things? And then critically, you use that as your starting point for policy. So whether you're sitting in the health department or you're sitting in the sort of social care department or local government or national government, you say, okay, those are the things that we care about as a society. My policy, surely interventions must be trying to support one of those outcomes. And that's how we start to shift the system. And that's how we create the domino effect. And we're seeing it happening. You know, my hope is actually in the course of the next 10 years, we'll see it all across sub-national government. And the national government will be like, somehow we feel that we've been left behind. And there will be a push towards rethinking the way we think about success. Brilliant.
Kate, did you want to say something briefly?
Yeah, I'll just add briefly to that. And so on those new metrics, and as Miata said, it brings us all the way back here. It's a dashboard, right? And we think about health. You talked about the health of the economy. We would never measure our own bodily health with one metric. It's a whole dashboard of indicators that tell us if we're healthy and well. And by the way, it's about balance. So let's measure the health of our economy with a dashboard. And I've often said, you know, imagine if the governments of nations were to stand up every year in their parliaments and not talk about what GDP is doing, but report against a dashboard like this. How are we, and how successful and how fast are we getting everybody in this nation out of that space of deprivation, ensuring a decent basic of life for everyone? How are we bringing our nation back within planetary boundaries? And I'm thrilled to say actually that again, the City of Amsterdam, in their leadership in this area, have said, right, this autumn, we're going to do it. We're going to produce a State of Amsterdam Doughnut report, and we're going to start holding ourselves to account against how we're performing on that. Again, leadership from one place, who knows where we could be. Let's meet again in a few years' time and see to what extent is that social guarantee really happening? To what extent is UBI something that's normal in some places? To what extent have some governments said, yeah, we're going to report, hold ourselves accountable? Are we coming into this safe and just space where we meet the needs of all within the means of the living planet?
Brilliant. Thank you. And I'll wrap up because otherwise the festival will never have me back. But thank you both very much. It was such an engaging talk. We could obviously go on and the questions are still coming. So thanks so much. The recording of this event, you can listen again. It'll be on the YouTube channel, which will be accessible on Watch Again on the festival website after the 20th of June. You'll be contacted by email when the video is available to view. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Kate's book, Doughnut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, copies will be available from the festival's partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. And there is an email address, which I think you probably would have been sent at some point in your bump. We very much like to continue to be engaged with York Festival of Ideas, and you can check out the website to see other things in this series. Do join us again next week. There's a second series on the leveling up the economy, where we'll be exploring what leveling up actually means, because I think that seems quite important, and whether it's even possible. Really have a fun. This has been such a great event. I think it's going to be really tough to surpass it. But thanks ever so much and for attending today, and have a wonderful day. And thanks so much.